this is a phrase I often say: the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
And I would say that that's what the rental moratoriums were. When you mess with the delicate ecosystem that is the landlord-tenant relationship, no matter how well intentioned your motives were, there are going to be consequences. And now we are really seeing the ramifications of that. So let's go back to the beginning with that. Obviously, there was a lot of uncertainty how to deal with the pandemic. And so there was massive job loss, and people were unable to pay their rent. Those are obviously legitimate concerns. And so the federal government, as well as state governments and even local municipalities, such as the city of Detroit, enacted their own rental moratoriums, which mean that basically landlords were prevented from availing themselves of the legal system when a tenant defaulted on their rental obligation. Now, we saw these in the mortgage world as well. There were some suspensions on foreclosures, but really those rents or those mortgage payments were just sort of being tacked on at the back end of the note. But in the rental moratoriums, there was a lot of misinformation that was out there that renters thought that they just didn't have to pay rent during this time. Well, that was untrue. The rental obligation still was maintaining. And so, but unfortunately, the landlords were unable to find ways to reclaim their unit. Now, many landlords, they're human beings, and sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle, especially when you go on the blogosphere and you go on social media, right? The landlord's evil and all this. It's far from the truth. Many of these landlords, in fact, the majority of landlords in the country are mom and pops. They're looking for vehicles for college education for their children. They're entrepreneurs. Yes, there are a lot of large companies or REITs, but there are many different landlords. There's 31 flavors of them. So when they have mortgage payments, they have maintenance obligations. When they have all these bills that they have to pay, if they can't get rent from the property, that's a major problem. And so during this time, there was movement on getting some rental assistance, but of course, look, it's the government, so it takes time to administer that. That was sort of the next phase of it. There's been multiple phases of it. In Michigan, there's the CERA, which is the COVID Emergency Rental Assistance Program. That has been helpful, but again, it's dependent on the local bureaucratic entity and how efficient they are in administering it, and they're just overwhelmed by the demand. So those are all factors that happen. And so what happened is there was over $50 billion of lost rental income over the course of the height of the pandemic. It's still growing. And what happens? Well, that has to be recouped somewhere. And so I was sounding an alarm saying, look, when you do this, again, let's try to work with tenants. Let's try to get on ways to get on a payment plan. Certainly, economic factors have changed. We're now, due to all sorts of issues with inflation and everything else, especially in Michigan, there's millions of jobs opening. And so there's opportunities to work with tenants and landlords. Look, contrary to popular belief, when landlords file eviction actions, it's not just to evict a tenant, it's to try and just bring the tenant back to the table and try to work things out. My clients did not, believe me, they don't want to call me and have me on speed dial all the time. That costs money. So they want to see if they can work out things with their tenants. And there was a lot of robust dialogue that happened between landlord and tenants. But of course, that is not a sexy soundbite. And so, when you see this narrative that's out there that's saying, oh, well, the tenants can't pay and the landlords are trying to be heavy-handed, that just wasn't the case. But what is the case is that now what we're seeing is rents have skyrocketed. And why is that? Many different reasons. One, the COVID certainly exacerbated the pre-existing affordable housing crisis that was here. Two is new buildings are just not being built fast enough. And again, we're talking primarily residential here. And so that was a major factor that, again, has not been helped out by where we are. Labor costs are up, materials are up. Certainly the disruptions in the supply chain. The real estate market is replete with those horror stories. So we're not seeing enough of supply being built to keep up with the demand. We're seeing a lot of first-time home buyers just not able to get out of their parents' basement to do it, but maybe they're trying. And so all of these factors are contributing to a housing market that has been rising. Now it's cooling off a little bit, but that trickles down to the rental market. And so you've got all these additional renters on the market that's factoring in. You've got lost revenues, got all these things. So that's driving up the price of rents. So from an investment possibility, if you can weather the next governmental interfering storm, it's actually, the prognosis is pretty good. But the question is, are we going to see these massive reactions to that? And of course, I think we're in an election year. So, I'm sure that's not going to have any impact whatsoever on what's going to happen. So it's no place for a nervous person, but listen, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So we're seeing rentals increase. We're seeing some pushback by that. When you see this, you're always going to hear the old refrains of rent control and all these other things, but none of that has ever proven effective. It's never worked. It never will work. Let the market do what it does, and let individuals be free to contract with each other and handle their business accordingly. So that's kind of where we are. It's a mess, and hopefully I haven't lost your audience completely, and they're now watching. I don't know, they're watching ESPN or something. But no, listen. It's an exciting time, that's for sure. It's not boring.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and it seems to me like when things like this happen, when big government steps in as like the hero, we're going to save the day. And on the surface, they make these massive knee-jerk intervention, reactionary, rules or changes. It's always, the narrative around it is always like, we're going to help the little guy. And it does nothing but exactly what you said, like that money, you can't just like stop the income from coming in and expect that that's not going to have any ramifications. At the same time, out the other side of their mouth, they're saying we need more affordable housing. And the landlords that are providing that affordable housing are the ones that they hurt the hardest. They have the lowest rents. And so what are they going to do? They have to raise their rents to recoup some of that income. And it starts this vicious cycle. And at the end of the day, the guy that gets hurt the most is the one that, the wage workers who are barely making rent to start with. And now rents are a lot higher because of these changes. So I agree with you that the market needs to work itself out without these big knee-jerk changes.
It's like, what's the definition of the little guy, right? The little guy, yes, is the wage earner, but also the little guy is the mom and pop who decided to put all their life savings into their rental properties.
Right. Exactly.
And so, you can't, I don't know, I'm not a physics major. Okay. But you can't, you can't, I believe me, all lawyers, they avoided math to go into, either they would be doctors or they go into law. But the fact of the matter is that when you prop up one part of the population, it's always going to be the equation is always going to be the negative detriment to another. There is no such thing as this equilibrium that we're desperately trying to find. You're trying to level the playing field so that the market can take care of things. But when you start interfering, as you said, Kirby, it's going to be a mess, and it continues to be a mess. And that's what I had said to anybody who would listen to me. And I'm just some landlord tenant attorney in the wilderness out here, But I said, look, if you do this, all you're going to do is hurt your constituents. You're going to hurt individuals who, first of all, for the majority who are actually making their rental obligations, barely, you're just going to raise their rents.
Yeah.
And the municipalities, they want to wet their beaks too, right? So they're going to raise. We've seen it across the board: more regulation, more inspections, all of this other stuff. Again, that's not free.
Yeah.
So who is that going to impact? These are not, listen, when I go in a courtroom and I have to make a macroeconomics lecture, okay, it's like glossy-eyed everybody, right? And I get it, but I still make the argument, and I'm hopeful that somebody will listen at some point and say, maybe this is a bad idea. Maybe we shouldn't not only have, a moratorium on things, but then when the courts start going again, maybe we should try the best we can to move these cases along. And that right now is the state of affairs of the legal process, which is also a mess. The legal process right now for landlord tenant, and you see it across the board, whether it's being aided or not by, governmental intervention. Even if it's not, the still problem is, look, these bureaucratic entities are not immune to labor shortages. And we're seeing a lot of retirement of some of the old grizzled veterans who just knew where everything was. And unfortunately, there's just not enough time in this fast-paced world right now, post-COVID, to train and get things up to speed. I mean, like, they're doing their best, but they're overwhelmed. There's a pent-up demand that's still trying to get out there. They're trying to then navigate through all this governmental, monetary assistance. How does that get administered? Those are in different, sometimes contradictory timelines. So everything is taking more time and everything is more expensive. And so that impacts everybody.
Got it. Yeah.
I'm not invited to many parties.
No, it's good background to understand. Is there anything somebody listening to this can do to protect themselves or their investments if the government does something like this again? Is there any steps they could take? Well,
I mean, it starts preemptively. It doesn't go out of style to say location, location, location. It's not enough, though, anymore. If you really want to be an educated investor, okay, and I'm not giving investment advice. I suppose, lawyer weasel disclaimer, none of this is meant to be legal advice either, right? So this is just informative purposes only. So they train that first day in law school. Make sure you get your disclaimers right and get your money up front. That's it. But no, it's not enough anymore to know the comps in your area. You really should know how the legal system's working in your area. Certain areas, certain municipalities are much more streamlined and run more efficiently than others. And certainly in some of the larger cities, it's very tenant oriented, and that's not going to change anytime soon, especially since, we're in the aftermath right now. Know how long it's going to take when the deal goes bad to protect yourself. You've got to know how to cover your flanks, so to speak. Don't get, dollar signs in your eyes and leap first. Now, listen, that's not to say that you should be paralyzed by fear. It's just that you should be realistic and know what is entailed if you have to use the court system. How long are things taking? What are certain municipal obligations like? Are they going to hit you for all sorts of inspection fees and all sorts of other stuff if you're going to buy maybe a small apartment building, something like that? Those are all things that you really need to know. If you really wanted to take a deep dive, if you were really anal retentive like me, maybe you might want to know in certain, jurisdictions like Ann Arbor, for example, right? It's my alma mater over there, but still I can sometimes speak that they're very individual oriented, like you would imagine in like LA and other places, Chicago. They have different municipal ordinances, such as you can't discriminate against somebody's source of income, which means basically if they're getting some sort of government assistance, you can't just say, look, I don't take government vouchers. That's just not part of my metrics, or my third-party management company doesn't take that. That's putting yourself in harm's way from fair housing. So when you're doing your due diligence, if you're going to be using a third-party management company or you're going to be doing it yourself, these are things that, hey, listen, ignorance of the law is no excuse. You need to know these things.
Yeah.
But I'm not here to deter anybody from investing in property, not far from it. But, be smart about it. That's all.
Yeah, that's good advice. And there's a reason why I and hundreds of thousands of others have left the Chicago area and moved to places like Northwest Indiana, where I live, or Florida, or one of these others that are quite a bit more friendly to people who want to invest and want to own business.